Welcome to the meeting, and could I invite Sarah Templeton to open the meeting with a karakia tēnā.
Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atakura. He tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihei, mauriora.
Kia ora. Kia ora. I have apologies from Councillor James Goff and Councillor Phil Major for absence from the meeting. Would someone like to move that they be accepted? Jimmy Chen, seconded by Jake McCowan. I'll put that motion. All those in favour say aye. Those opposed say no. That's carried. I haven't received any declarations of interest. I'll move on to the hearings panel report, but I'll invite Gavin Thomas to present the report. Thank you.
Thank you. The report today and the attachments are associated with the review the Council has undertaken of its development contributions policy. In the first instance, the Council will consider the submissions received. Then there are a number of items for deliberation, followed by the Council adopting a final policy. So, can I... Am I live here or? Got it. No? Got it. Thank you. So just running through the process. So firstly, the summary of submissions, then submissions feedback we received from the community, some minor changes that have been proposed to the policy, change to the methodology to forecast growth demand for transportation, and we have two members of the transportation team here, Richard and Hamid, and they will run through that with you. Then we have the proposals for deliberation, and then indicative DC charges by location, so you can see where we've landed in respect to the policy changes and the charges that are associated with it. So just running through a summary of the submissions process, we received 34 submissions, 17 of those were from organisations and 17 from individuals. All submitters were from within the Christchurch rating area. And one noticeable thing this time about the submitters were that none of the peak organisations submitted, such as the New Zealand Property Council or the Chamber of Commerce. So it was more this time, more community submissions and from organisations with a direct impact in terms of the DCs and mostly about specific issues. What they told us, overall there was strong support for using development contributions as a fair way to fund growth infrastructure. There was overall support for the vast majority of the key proposals. There was one exception, and that was the proposal to extend the small residential unit adjustment to 35 square metres from the current 60 square metres, and we'll go through that in some detail a little later. So submissions feedback about the policy direction and general approach, that was well supported. The Littleton Port Company submission proposed a minor change to the wording of policy objective 2, so we've suggested that change be taken up. Submitters were asked whether they thought it was fair that developers pay a share of the cost of infrastructure to support growth, and that was overwhelmingly supported. There were some alternative ways to fund growth infrastructure proposed by a small number of submitters. Lobby central government, GST for construction returned to councils, which and that council undertakes development itself. So interesting ideas that may want to be pondered at some point. Proposed changes to the draft policy. Firstly, the increased use of catchments. So that was in the draft that went out for submission. Generally, that was well supported. There were some alternatives suggested, mostly relating to the DC charge infrastructure nexus. So that's whether the charge itself is being returned to the area in which the charge was taken. Littleton Port Company and the airport raised some questions about catchments applying to their specific properties, and we will meet with them in the near future to discuss the concerns that they have. An option to have a maximum charge or cap was included in the submission, in the consultation document rather. So all submissions on that option were opposed on the basis that true costs should be considered by developers. Business developments to pay community infrastructure DCs. Generally one's well supported. One submitter, which was the University of Canterbury, opposed on the basis that it was there was uncertainty regarding the demand from a non-residential development, and we acknowledged that from the outset, which is why we proposed that it only be one HUI per development. So we're saying that there is some demand, but we can't judge exactly what that demand will be based on the type of business or the size. Business development to pay reserves DCs. So again, this was well supported. The one submitter, again, the same as the on the previous issue, opposed on the basis that it's of uncertainty regarding demand from each development. One submitter wanted businesses to pay more than the proposed one household unit equivalent, and one submitter wanted business differential increased as it is a tax expense. DCs to fund improved neighbourhood parks facilities in areas experiencing intensification. So there was a variety of views expressed, although to be fair most were in support. Council reinvestment in high growth intensification areas was raised as an issue by submitters. This isn't a development contributions policy issue per se, but more one of for city planning and levels of service and asset planning to deal with in the first instance, and then for the DC policy to respond to as a funding tool. But some work is certainly going on in that area to look further into that issue. Proposed Akaroa DC charges. So the draft policy included a proposal that the charges at Akaroa, or aggregated charges, would move from $21,500 per household unit equivalent to $68,700. This is driven mostly by the wastewater treatment and disposal investment the council's making in Akaroa, and that moved that particular development contribution from $2,900 to $48,000. That $2,900 figure is from the previous policy, and that was derived using a district-wide catchment. So this is the result of applying a sub-district catchment to an activity where the council is making significant investment in one part of the district. One submission clearly opposed applying a catchment approach and raised the issues that it might have in terms of impact on Akaroa and on the DCs there. No submissions supported a cap or a maximum charge in response to the use of catchments. 6 submissions specifically called for no maximum charge. And the Banks Peninsula Community Board submission was against a maximum charge or cap. So there were a number of other points raised by submitters. That arterial roading benefits the wider Christchurch region. That's acknowledged and that's taken into account when the council allocates the cost of growth to both local catchments and at a district-wide basis. Some greenfield developments don't have reasonable access to active transport or public transport routes. That's something that over the course of the rollout of the cycleway program and the public transport program, any gaps in service will be adequately covered off. Christchurch International Airport Limited believes some of the land it owns has been incorrectly classified, so again we will take that up with them and find out what their concerns are and if anything needs to be addressed. Development contributions in the central city should be lower than in the donut suburbs. To a large extent this policy will deliver that. Medium density housing usually has small backyards and people are reliant on neighbourhood parks. Again, that's acknowledged and that's something that we are working with the parks planners to improve. DCs in high and medium density residential areas should be used to upgrade existing ageing infrastructure within that community, not other areas of the city. Well, DCs can't be used for renewals, and where we use catchments, the revenue from within that catchment is applied to that catchment. So it's very much a case of where we take it from, we spend it. Allocation of DCs should be in areas of greatest need based on higher density development and social deprivation. Well, again, we can only fund the growth component of new infrastructure to service growth from development contributions, so it's based on where those costs are incurred rather than other drivers of such as social deprivation. Social housing providers do not contribute to DCs, however they bring people into community placing demand. Well, Kainga Ora does pay DCs and they are by far the biggest social housing provider. There are a small number of community housing providers who have received the council's social housing rebate, but as I say, that's a very small number of developments in the wider social housing delivery scheme of things. And these are a few other points that were raised. So stormwater, if there is on-site retention and treatment required, there is almost always an offset in the development contribution for stormwater. A comment on the central city rebates, which we will look at another day. DC rebates should be used to incentivise universal design standards. That's something that can be considered as well in terms of any potential new rebates that the council wants to look at, if it wanted to look at that. The definition of a kitchen and not included in the policy, that was a drafting error that we've fixed. Online estimator we'll look at, and credits undertaken for work around waterways and wetlands as a condition of consent. They're quite different. Where we require work as a condition of consent, that has no impact or bearing on the development contributions required for that development. So some minor changes proposed to the policy. So firstly, to reinstate the definition of kitchen. So that responds to a submission which raises it and is actually an absolutely essential part of the policy because we use it to define what a new household unit is. We've added a column in the schedule of assets for transportation activities to show waka kotahi funding. That was something that councillors asked for at a previous briefing, so we've now been able to include that. We've had to make some changes to table 2 where it hadn't been updated to reflect the new average household composition of 2.5 people rather than 2.6. So we've had to change the numbers in that table. And there was a range of minor wording changes recommended by the Legal Services Unit, which are highlighted in the version of the policy you have in yellow. And they are there to improve clarity and to just tighten up the wording of the policy itself. We've proposed to add reference to Te Turi Whenua Māori Act and the requirement for the council to give or to consider the principles of the preamble of that act. So there's been a short section added to that highlights the fact that you've introduced a rebate scheme as part of that response. And then again, a number of various changes to correct typos and inconsistencies. Now, Hamid and Richard will talk to you about the change to the methodology to forecast growth, demand and transportation.
Thanks, Kevin. Good afternoon, Mayor and dear councillors. My name is Hamid Mirbaha. I'm a senior transport planner in transport planning as a planning team. So we made a few changes to the way that we are sort of forecasting the demand to calculate DC charges. And the driver for that change was that we realized we couldn't consider the targets of the council, the emission targets, and council's high-level strategies in terms of climate change and support for sustainable transport into the old methodology. The old methodology was all about assuming that business as usual would continue in the future, and population grows, everybody will be driving their cars, and there will be more cars driven on the roads. Obviously, it's not the direction that we are getting from you. Therefore, we needed to make some changes to the methodology to consider all of these changes. So one of those changes is now we are targeting on the population growth as opposed to a number of cars driving on the road. And this is now the building blocks for us. Previously, as I say, it was vehicle kilometers traveled. It's now population growth being 10%. Has been forecasted. The population of Christchurch has been forecast to increase by 10% over the next 10 years. So we have assumed that 10% of the future population would be the growth community and 90% would be the existing community. And that's how we split the costing based on the two communities. Another change that we've made, again, compared to travel time, to the vehicle kilometers traveled, we are using trips. Just the number of trips generated from each development, and that has mainly been done to discount the non-car trips. Therefore, if a development is creating more cycling trips or more walking and public transport trips, there should be a recognition of that as opposed to development which is mostly or highly reliant on car trips. So we've done this change as well, and again, in line with the council's strategies. We have made the assumption that when an active or public transport project is delivered, the existing users who free up the capacity on the network, this will indirectly benefit those ones who still use cars to drive around. Therefore, the benefit of delivering a cycleway project is still applicable for those people who are driving their cars, for people who are living further afield, like in new growth developments, although they might not get any direct benefit from a cycleway which is happening somewhere around the central city. They still can benefit from the extra capacity freed up to them to drive into the central city or anywhere around the network. Cool. So as a result, we have extended the range of chargeable LTP projects, which are chargeable through DC chargers. Obviously, we have excluded Crown-funded projects, shovel-ready, craft, global settlement, and as Gavin mentioned, the NZTA funding assistance rate through the process. The other change that we've made, which is very important, is consideration to the development density. There are winners and losers in this. Winners would be dense developments like this building having 6 stories in the same amount of land. Therefore, the density would be 600%, like as an example, comparing it to, say, a development in Hornby, a supermarket with like 30% density, majority of the land is a car park. So we have now focusing on the part of the building, part of the area, which is actually responsible for creating all of those demands. So therefore, there will be a recognition of the building, which is, well, the development, which is attracting more car trips as opposed to development, which is more aligned with more density subsettings and more focus on sustainable modes of transport. So applying all of these factors, all charges are less compared to what we have consulted on in terms of transport. The main reduction is, however, related to historic charges, charges for active transport on historic projects. And when I'm saying historic projects, these are, to clarify that, these are the projects which might have not started yet, like major cycle routes of Avon Atakura or Wales to Wings. We consider them historic because they existed in the previous LTP, but the DC charges were calculated by the previous methodology, being like around 30 or 40%. Now we have lowered them down to 10%, as very similar to the rest of the program. So the part of the active transport has reduced as a result. So that's one part of the change. The other change that we've made, which I think is in the next slide, the one after. Yeah, we've added another catchment to the catchments of the city, and this catchment is inner city. It's more focusing on those medium to high density areas around key activity centers, or where we are wanting to increase the density. And it's in line with the spatial plan of Christchurch. So we wanted to have better clarification and more accurately allocating the subsequent DC charges for those areas as opposed to the rest of the suburbia. And covering for those investments in the streetscape improvements around medium density and high density areas in those areas. So those are the changes we made to the transport.
Just to, the changes Hamid went through with the DC methodology, the majority of those were in the draft policy that we consulted on. So what we found before we've brought this version of the policy to you was that there were some parts of that were producing anomalies, and that was particularly these historic projects and the way that they were calculated. When using the new district plan zone assessment ratios. So what's happened, Hamid has tweaked the methodology used rather than changed it in between the draft policy and now, and there's simply no way around that. We have to get this right. So it's not a case of it being a nice to do, it's a must do, because we've moved to this new methodology of calculation based on increasing population rather than forever increasing the number of cars on the road. So it was unfortunate that it wasn't picked up in the first instance, but as I say, it's a must-have. And then, whoops. With the inner city catchment, the modelling work that was done for the DC policy that went out for consultation included the inner city catchment. But for whatever reason, the catchment itself wasn't provided to go into the policy, and the map that showed that catchment wasn't provided. So this is more or less catching up on work that should have been done at that point. And also, if you look at the bottom of that slide, the impact of separating out an inner city catchment from the broader suburban catchment is tiny. A combined catchment as presented in the original policy would have a DC cost of $1,100 per Huey, and when separating them, the inner city is $1,137 and the suburban $1,091. But the benefit of having the inner city catchment is around this issue of streetscape amenity in the medium density areas of the city. So it enables us to target investment and DC charges to that inner city catchment. An issue raised by a submitter to the draft policy was to include an assumed demand for a care bed suite within a retirement village. This is a kind of a technical issue. We have had an assumed demand for other types of beds within a retirement village, but not for a care bed suite. So we just added that. We have used the demand assumptions that we use as a council here rather than the ones from Auckland which the submitter suggested we use. And it just makes the whole assessment process much easier and smoother. So this has arisen from a submission, but that we totally agree is an improvement to the policy. And now we have this issue of the small residential unit adjustment. So in the current policy, we have provision to adjust the development contribution charge on a residential unit that has a floor area less than 100 square metres. And there's a sliding adjustment approach, so that if the floor area is, say, 70 square metres, then we will say that that's 0.7 of a Huey, and that development will pay 70% of the normal DC charge. That adjustment runs down to 60 square metres under the current policy and then stops. That gross floor area measurement includes garaging, and where there are residential units without garaging, 17.05 square metres is added as an assumed garage area. So that effectively reduces the adjustment for residential units without garaging. So what was proposed in the draft policy was two things. Firstly, to remove the garaging adjustment because it's complicated for developers and for our assessors to use. It lacks what we think is a sound rationale. It's at odds with the council's district plan and the MPSUD, whereby parking is not to be required. And removing it makes it easy for the developers and the assessors to administer. The second part of the change that was proposed in the policy was to change the maximum small residential unit adjustment from 60 square metres to 35 square metres. So that goes down to the smallest residential unit permitted under the district plan. It encourages or doesn't discourage smaller housing options, including family flats and tiny houses. And a previous small standalone residential rebate that the council has had in the past, which is currently expired, wouldn't be needed going forward. So in terms of submissions from the community, we had 1 submission in support of the proposal, 4 submissions opposed the proposed changes, some on the basis that the size of a dwelling isn't a reliable indicator of demand on infrastructure. 4 submissions offered alternative approaches, with 2 suggesting the number of bedrooms would be a better approach. There are other councils that use number of bedrooms as a means to, or as a trigger to make an adjustment. We have not used that, partly because it's difficult to know what is and isn't a bedroom. So we have stuck with gross floor area as that trigger rather than bedrooms. So in terms of going forward, Council has 3 options. 1 is to proceed with the proposed approach included in the draft policy, which is what staff recommend. So that would remove the garaging adjustment. It would extend the possible adjustment based on floor area to 0.35 of a HUI. It would provide further relief for family flat developments. It would be consistent with the district plan and the NPSUD, and would encourage intensification, compact living, tiny houses. Option 2 is status quo, to leave the adjustment as it currently is in the existing policy. So that would continue to disadvantage smaller developments, would continue the current situation of DC assessments being time consuming and technical, would not be consistent with the district plan or the NPSUD, and the council may decide it needed a rebate scheme if that approach was taken. And a third approach would be to maintain the status quo but remove the garaging adjustment. That I guess makes things easier and is consistent with the NPSUD and the district plan, but it doesn't deliver those further advantages to compact living, tiny houses, smaller living. So just running through the proposed charges, DC charges by location, using the draft policy as presented to you today. So the central city would see its DC charge reduced from just over $21,500 to a little over $8,000. This includes GST. And the main driver for that is the reduction in parks development contributions, and that impacts on all catchments, all parts of the city, but also the move to using catchments for water and wastewater activities. That makes a massive difference for the inner city areas. So if you look there, you have wastewater collection in the current policy is $6,300. In the revised policy, $300. So that shows you the benefit of moving to the catchments when you're utilising your existing infrastructure networks to service growth. Same story for an area like Linwood in the infill area, so from 22,700 to 8,000 for exactly the same reasons. Riccarton, which is also a medium density area, but a little further out, similar result, but the DC is a little higher at $11,000. Horswell Greenfield, reduces by, $2,500, but there are two things at play in the greenfield areas. One is the reduction in development contributions from the parks activities, and the other is the increase in, and in this case that increase is around stormwater and flood protection. So that goes from 5,000 to 15,000. Belfast Greenfield, very much the same as Hallsville, and again a big drop in the parks charges and a big increase in stormwater and flood protection. And Littleton, Littleton has changed the most following between the draft DC policy we consulted on and this version, and that is all around water supply, where there was a significant change to the growth allocation in one project. When the asset planners reviewed the figures, they believed that they needed to make an adjustment in there, and so that's taken that down from 12,800 to 5,900. So overall, the development contribution for Littleton would drop from 21,500 in the current policy to 19,000 in the new policy. And Akaroa, which we've spoken about earlier, significant increase in total development contribution. So that goes from 21,500 to 68,700, and that is all about wastewater treatment and disposal. So that goes under a district-wide catchment. It was $2,900. Go to a sub-district catchment, and you look at an area of the district where the council's making massive investment in infrastructure, and it shoots up to 48,300. So, I guess time for questions, if you...
Questions, Sam?
Yeah, thank you. A couple of things, and it may be a question for the engagement team if they're here. Oh, yeah. Can someone please talk me through how we've engaged with stakeholders around this? Because we only got 15 submissions.
We got 34 submissions. We emailed out to a database of developers and interested parties that we have. Yep. So we did that twice, I think, Tessa. Certainly we did it at the beginning of the process. We did it at the beginning, yeah. It was, we did roadshow drop-ins in parallel with the long-term plan. I did a presentation to the New Zealand Property Council. I think the lack of interest from the development sector is, I think, a result of the reducing development contributions charges.
Right, so you're relatively comfortable with, we've consulted with?
They've had the opportunity to...
Well, yeah, it might be a question for engagement though, if you don't mind. Yeah, absolutely. And just turn your mic on so that... What happened with this one is it was... Just turn your mic on? Yeah.
It was in the market for exactly the same time as the long-term plan. So initial communication with our general stakeholders went out in tandem. So it was an email to all stakeholders saying the long-term plan and development contributions are now open. Admittedly, the focus of that email, understandably, was the long-term plan. However, there was that follow-up email from Gavin to those key stakeholders for this particular industry. The other thing that we then did, coming on board a week later, was a climate change strategy and the REP review. Now, every single one of those consultations, when we communicated, they talked about each other. So everything linked to everything else. So when people were going in, we were aware it was a really busy time for our key stakeholders. So we were just trying to, every time they interacted with us, help them understand that there were other consultations out there at the same time. That's why, you know, when we did the drop-in sessions, it was all 4 of them at the same time. Any community meetings that we went to at that time, it was a presentation about all 4 of them. Now that might have meant that some of the noise was distracting, I suppose you could say, but that's the situation that we were dealing with.
Right, yeah, because I've had feedback that people weren't aware of it, which has caused some issues. So, I'm just looking at like 2.3.1, which is around the existing demand credits, and we're looking at how we change the policy. I mean, would that have been the appropriate time during that submission phase for people to come in and share their view? I'm just trying to understand on that level. If you're someone, so we're reviewing the DC policy. If you're someone that's got existing credits in the CBD or in the city, how they would have had the opportunity? Would it be purely through that submission phase to share a view on that?
Well, they can share a view any time, but certainly a policy review is an ideal time to raise an issue with that. That wasn't something that was proposed to change. That was something that was proposed to carry through from the previous policy.
So, and probably just the other one, Leanne, is if we are wanting, is this a forum for, because I've only been on hearings panels which are a lot smaller than this, except for rep review, but is this the forum where we would propose changes to the policy now? Or, is it a simple yes or no, we either accept it or we don't?
We need legal advice for that, so I'll hand over to Lynn.
So I see Ian's here, but my understanding is that we would need to go out with an explicit proposal for change. But Ian, would you like to? Yeah, and to get submissions on that. Yes, that's right.
It really does depend on the significance of the changes. The changes that have been discussed by Gavin, I think, are within the ambit of the consultation process that we've undertaken. We've gone out with options, we've had feedback. Gavin has analysed that and come up with some changes that have flown from the process. I'm not quite sure what changes you're considering, Sam, but I'm comfortable with the process that we've got with the changes that are proposed.
Yeah, Sam just asked the question, is this the time to make changes to the policy? So, Sam, do you have an amendment?
Well, around the existing demand credits, I would have thought, I just think that would be the appropriate time to look at removing that limit. I don't know why we'd have a 10-year limit on it.
Well, there's a very good reason why I have a 10-year limit on it, but
It just seems weird people would pay twice. But
That might have been something that could have been raised when the draft policy was being looked at, but that's a very significant change, and that would be a change from the current policy. So it really would be a significant deviation from where we've been in the past.
so how often can we amend this policy?
It's required to be reviewed every 3 years, but we can review it any time within that period.
So that is something that could be raised independently of that. I wasn't at the workshop, so I wasn't aware whether this had been raised before. It may not have been.
This was specifically raised and some options presented when we were developing the draft policy. So, and I can send you the information that was presented to councillors then, if you like.
Sarah?
I'm just trying to figure out, while we're doing this as a big package this time, my recollection is actually that we've dealt with that specific issue in isolation in the past, maybe just a couple of years ago. And it might be that there's a report, as well as the information from the draft, that's able to be circulated.
Yep.
Because I'm pretty sure we've made a decision as a separate standalone thing on that as a council relatively recently. To be reviewed during the policy, that when we did the workshop. Yeah.
I can certainly circulate all material
that would be great.
Related to that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've got Yanni and Jimmy and Andrew.
Just so the fact that someone's made a submission on the Central City rebates and that it should be stopped.
Yep.
Do we we have scope to do that as part of this process today?
No, not as part of this process, because that rebate scheme doesn't sit as part of or connected to the DC policy. It sits underneath the council's development contributions rebate policy. But I will be giving councillors a briefing in August on the Central City rebate scheme, where it's at the moment, and options for going forward.
So it was an LTP matter?
No, it's a separate matter from both the LTP and the development contributions policy itself.
Okay. And yeah, I think maybe just communicating that to people would be useful. I was just a little bit concerned at the use of the phrase inner city for areas that are in the suburbs. And I know that that's probably based on some sort of residential medium density zone. So when you look at the planning maps, it obviously overlays. But is there a different phrase that we could use that would just give people a sense of a bit of greater clarity around that? Or do we have to use what you've provided?
We could change that to medium density.
I don't know how others feel, but like to say that people...
I think it would help clarify the policy itself if you referred to it as medium density. That would be helpful. Thank you.
And the other question I had, just looking at the community infrastructure and the neighbourhood parks charges. So if you take like Riccarton medium density, the current charge for neighbourhood parks is dropping to the final change is $80 from $1,700. There's a $1,700 difference. But given that those are the communities that have come and said to us, we want more neighbourhood parks to cater for the fact that we're losing, with growth, we're losing our trees and our amenity and our green space.
Yep.
Well, is there another way that we're reflecting that? I just can't quite make the connection between the charges and the intent of the policy.
The policy, the DC policy, reflects the council's CAPEX program, but Russell, who is the Parks Asset Planner, can provide you with more information on that.
Thank you. The DC reduction for the neighbourhood parks is due to a number of factors. The majority of our projects in the LTP are renewal projects, which, as you're aware, don't have a growth component, or if they do, they have a very small growth component. Many of the CAPEX projects in this proposed policy compared to the last policy have now been completed. So we're no longer charging DCs or collecting DCs for those projects. There's also the council through the LTP there's very few new parks CAPEX projects in there. So therefore we don't have the opportunity to charge a lot of DC reserve growth components of those.
And so I guess I come back to the whole chicken and egg thing, which I tried to move an amendment to the LTP to add projects. That was ruled out of order. We're now doing this. It's ruled out of order. Like, when do we ever get a chance to put those projects on so that we can attract the DCs to get them done?
You need to have an analysis of where the parks will be located, and then you have to put them on the budget. So you have to make a decision to do that. No, well, you can't just move an amendment to the...
We used to have a neighbourhood reserves fund and strategic land funds to deal with these things. We've got green space strategies galore that talk about addressing the lack of green space in some of these areas. Like, I'm sorry, but I don't...
So they do need to go onto the capital program.
Right. Cool. So how can you do that? What's the easiest process to do that? It's
not chicken and egg. They need to go onto the capital program first, and then they can be included in the DC charges.
But we have lots of high-level budgets that we, like strategic land purchases or neighbourhood reserves contributions. Like, we do have high-level program budgets.
To be allocated in the capital program first.
Well, that's what my amendment in the LTP tried to do, and it didn't even get put.
I'm just saying to you. Yeah.
It got ruled out of order.
Right.
We are planning to bring a briefing to council probably in October regarding how we deal with medium density residential neighbourhoods in terms of streetscape amenity and park provision, and that will be the beginning of something that will I suspect takes some time to address, but at least then we can have those conversations about what your expectations are and how best to formalise those expectations into something that can then be delivered as part of an asset program.
So as part of like the, you know, and at the start of this, it talks about working with developers and having the ability to do development agreements. Could we make more of a focus on that? So when, you know, someone's going into an area and we're discussing with them the assessment of the development contribution, could we actually make more explicit around something going back into the area to deal with the impact?
I should mention that as with the medium density intensification that we're looking at, a lot of the areas meet our level of service requirement for neighbourhood parks, and what we are proposing, or will be proposing, is that we look at increasing the provision of existing resources within those parks. So, for example, as the density increases in, say, Walton, for example, we could look at putting another half court or put a half court in Walton to cater for the needs of the more increased population. So there isn't a lot of areas in the city where where the neighbourhood parks provision is actually below the level of service. There's a few areas, but the majority of them, we do have our quota. It's really about ensuring that the parks can cater for the increased population. And we can do that if we have projects coming through for more equipment to fund the growth component.
Jimmy, I think you were next.
Okay, thank you. My question is, if we review these 7 proposed DC charges by location, it looks like 6 of the location, the total final DC policy charge all reduced, more or less. Only the Akorora is increased, but total the charges amount, whether it's 0, looks like every household, like Akorora, the increase 47,000 per household, but the other 6 reduced, total is 47, am I right? To council is still 0, not any different. I mean the incomes from the DC charges.
The income per household unit equivalent of development will decrease. And that's as a product of the investment the council's making in growth infrastructure.
Yeah, but if have a specific area, particularly consider, we would like to encourage like affordable housing to increase, but because location, is not a suitable location, has to be the pay more. Whether how to dealing with mitigate this effect.
Yeah, we can't use the development contributions policy as a means of incentivising or disincentivising development in an arbitrary fashion or based on preference. It's got to be based on the investment the council's making in growth infrastructure in a particular part of the city.
Okay.
Andrew?
Thank you. So referring to the Akorora figure, clearly you would have noted that the Akorora figure is twice as much as the next highest. Have you considered ways of mitigating that, either by way of a cap on Akorora or doing something differently with that wastewater charge in particular?
Certainly have looked at that. And the possibility of a cap was raised in the consultation document. The council has a requirement to consider community well-being and its community outcomes when it makes finance decisions, and it could consider this in that context. So certainly a cap would be possible. The issue we have, I guess, is that was floated in the submission and the consultation document, and the response from submitters was more in favour of no cap than having a cap.
So considering the effects on the well-being of the community, particularly if such a high figure resulted in no development at all, And I mean, this might be a question for Ian rather than for you. Is that something we could consider, we should consider, or we must consider?
I think it's something you could consider because, as Gavin said, we did go out for consultation with both options. However, would a reasonable council make that decision given the response from the community, the staff recommendation, the community view, community board's view? Is that a reasonable decision for the council to make, to go against that? It doesn't stop you. You've got the ability to do it. There may be a risk, a very low risk, I would think, of challenge, but you would have to consider whether it's reasonable for you to make that decision given the response that you've had from the community and others.
Okay, and just one final question on this. If we were to, for example, bring the charge down to, for Akaroa, down to a capped charge that was equal to Halswell, what effect would that have on areas other than Akaroa? Like, where would the extra charge come from?
So it would be treated similarly to a development contributions rebate, where it would be revenue foregone, and that revenue would be picked up by the ratepayers who pay the targeted rate for wastewater right throughout the district. The cost of offsetting it would be very, very minor because the forecast growth in Akaroa is 2.5 household units a year. So you're looking at a very small number.
All right, thank you.
Sarah?
Thank you. The community wellbeing aspect of that, I'm just wondering what types of things get considered. So Councillor Turner's point clearly about the potential growth in community, but when it comes to an area that we know is short of water over summer, does adding population, sort of permanent population to an area that's already got water shortages count as part of that community wellbeing as well?
It should do.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no prescription in terms of what can and can't be considered as impacting on community wellbeing.
Yeah.
This requirement in the Local Government Act with respect to finance policies is often referred to as the opportunity for council to stand back and look at the impact of its funding decisions. So it's just an opportunity to look through a different lens.
Yeah, and at the moment, while we have the water supply and the wastewater collection thing, and we have a project for the wastewater in Akaroa, if at some point there was a need for a new drinking water supply in that area, would that end up being covered in this particular catchment as well as a separate project and in the water supply?
For Akaroa, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is an Akaroa Harbour catchment for water supply.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
And
Thank you. It's incredibly complex, and you do a really good job of calmly explaining stuff. But if I was a resident of Halswell at the moment, looking at the table that you've presented here, I would be asking why, given the growth out there, we have the reduction in, say, the allocation to sports parks, for example, so can you just explain that in simple language, why that looks like that? Because it doesn't seem to make sense when we've talked a lot about growth and the fact that DCs are related to growth, and we look at that and we see there's going to be a need, there's going to be a demand, and yet that doesn't reflect that. So I'm sort of struggling with that a bit. Thanks.
The provision of parks is indicated in the outline development plan in the district plan. So we work out for the city where the provision of parks, which is related to our level of service. And so sports parks, we've now shifting more towards what's called sort of a hub basis. So instead of having single parks, we're grouped parks together. And Aruria, up in Belfast, for example, has been highlighted as one of the areas that we need to actually, we have land there, and that will be turned into a sports hub later. There is a sports network strategy being drafted at the moment, which will citywide, it's underway. But for Horswell, they do have their provision in the quota of sports field parks. There is not a shortage there, which is why the DCs have dropped as well.
So it's related to demand at the moment, rather than future demand?
No.
At the moment, rather than future demand?
No, it's actually future demand. So in the outline development plans for Horswell area, we have no sports parks required. There is enough sports parks there to actually meet, because also within the area we have Napunawai, and so that covers, that is one of the hubs as well. And also we had Wigram Skies was one of our more recent sports parks.
Right.
But there is no more indication that we need further sports parks in that area.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Aaron?
Yeah, just the explanation earlier around, there was the example of the supermarket in Hornby and car parking. Can you explain that slightly clearer? So they pay more now for what?
Yes, so let me just take this example a little bit further. Imagine this in the same supermarket creating 1,000 trips a day.
1,000 trips a day?
1,000 car trips a day.
So
Imagine
1,000
it's like
customers,
like a random number. It is coming from 30% of the land area which is covering. So this is a supermarket, this is a massive car park which is covering 70% of the land, and
Right.
the supermarket itself is like 30% of the land.
Yeah.
So what we've done differently this time, instead of saying these trips are generated by the entire land area, we said now these trips are generated by the gross floor area of the building here, not the car park itself. So as a result, trip per square meter of GFA has increased. It's like 3 times as big. Whereas compared to this building here, for example, imagine this trip is also generating the same amount of trips, like 1,000 trips a day. Per square meter of GFA, because the land area is like 6 times as bigger, so like because it's a 6-story building, it will be 6 times as lesser as the comparable sort of building in sort of like Hornby. Is it like clear enough or no? So it's just, you know, prior to this we were looking at the land area.
So does the supermarket pay more or less now?
The supermarket pays more now.
So food goes up?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Brilliant.
Thank you for that explanation, because I didn't get that before. That was really clear. Thank you. Yanni?
I just wanted to check on some of the tables that we've got, the information, like the bollards, the figures, the old figure. Is there a process to update the figures with the most relevant information? How does that work?
No, we use the information that's in the LTP, or if we were to update the policy in between LTPs, we could then look at whether we should or shouldn't update the CapEx amounts. We simply can't change policies or parts of policies every time a project is recosted.
But that one's like almost 500,000 more.
Yeah.
So could we just put the actual figure in, or?
No, because it's based on the LTP figure.
I think there's overs and unders too. You know, it does average itself out with projects. As Gavin said, we work off the figure in the long-term plan. If there's any changes to that budget and it goes through an internal approval process, we have to find the money from another project. So a lot of that does average itself out, if you're just looking at one example.
Right, okay. Just on the multi-use arena, is that in here anywhere? I mean, there's projects related to it, but the actual project isn't.
My understanding is it's not, and that's because the multi-use arena is smaller in capacity than Lancaster Park was. And so it's more a renewal project than a growth project.
Right, okay. But we've got like the Central City Transport interchange in here.
Yep.
Okay.
Mm.
Yeah, I don't.
That's growth. Is that the bus interchange?
Yeah, but we used to have a bus interchange as well. And it's probably like similar capacity.
Yeah.
So. I guess the question is just like, yeah, how robust is this list of projects? It's been obviously updated since we've passed the LTP, is what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And anything that's happened since then will be just out of date and it can be revised as part of an annual process or something.
When the policy is reviewed, if it's reviewed in between LTPs, that's an opportunity to update the CAPEX program. But as it stands, the CAPEX program aligns with the LTP. And as Richard says, you know, some numbers go up, some numbers go down, and there's an element of swings and roundabouts. The budget is so vast, it's never going to be 100% accurate.
Aaron and then Anne.
Yeah, just on the, when you look at a breakdown of anyone's DCs and the various things they do or don't get, the active transport and the public transport levies, where did they come from and where did they get? How did they get so big? Because the original active transport rate that's on everyone's rate is $20 a year, and that was to pay for the entire cycleway network that hasn't finished being rolled out. But something changed along the way, and then it's been tucked in here as well. And every new house, no matter what it is going to pay $1,000, which is 20 years worth of the other one, just shy of. Is it not? Okay, Professor Mike, would you like to enlighten us? $20 versus times divided out of 1,000.
Can you just explain what the active transport covers? Because I thought it covered footpaths as well. Am I wrong?
It's mainly most of the long-term plan. The large spending is around major cycleways, that type of thing. And so, as you said previously, Mayor, that anything that comes out of the long-term plan is reflected here. So that is reflecting our program. As we said before, we did strip out the all those that are shovel ready and craft funded. So any Crown funding has already been taken out, and we also deduct New Zealand Transport Agency's contributions. So those funds are coming out as well. But it does reflect the direction the council is taking.
And the total for active and public transport has gone down.
Yeah, but my question was that we have an active transport rate on rates, and then we have one on here as well, and the other one was to pay for the other. It was to pay for two things: the cycleway network, the entire rollout of the network, and the head-to-head walkway was the other one. We don't get many updates on that these days, but yeah. But it's got the same name, so are they different? Are they a completely different thing? Yeah, it was.
No.
They are two different ones. That's what I'm hearing from my left.
Yeah.
Oh, so this active travel is not the other active travel. It's not the same fund.
Well, this is reflected here is what's coming out of the capital program. I'm not sure what's coming out of the targeted rate.
Well, it was to pay for those, but
Because
this is
this is
so.
just
Which one does this pay for?
This is the growth component of the capital program. I'm really not sure what's coming out of the rate.
It's a what?
Sorry, if you just look at the information in front of you.
Yep.
The project isn't all funded by DCs, it's between rates and
Pieces.
Right.
$3 million a year.
but the NZTA funding's taken out of this, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, so we're not charging DCs on the
Yeah, it was
NZTA
specific
No.
component.
was the original.
Anne,
Thank you. 3.39, 3.9.2, which is on page 7 of the report. Development contributions high and medium density residential areas should be used to upgrade existing ageing infrastructure within that community, not other areas of the city. Can you explain a bit more about that? And does that relate to an area, say, in Horsell, where you've got an older suburb, say Milnes Road, and you've got huge amounts of development going along there, but the actual roading and the footpath and all that stuff's no good, and it's not going to cope with it. So does that apply to that situation, or is it because it's greenfields development it doesn't apply?
Yeah, it's greenfield development.
Right. Okay.
So that's that's why the charges are so much higher for the greenfield growth areas, because a lot of work has to be done in those locations to change roads that are fairly rural previously. The developers do a lot of cost themselves because they do all their frontages, but we have to then improve the whole road infrastructure as well too. And often we work with developers through private developer agreements where we share the cost of a new intersection, for instance, because that new intersection may satisfy the needs of that new subdivision, but it's also the wider community as well who use that road.
Yeah. So I would expect to see. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah. So that's why those that's why you see those Horsell charges higher, because we're having to do a lot more work in that area.
Right. So it sounds like it's be good to expect that to be developed as part of that. The big retirement village that's going in there, for example.
Yeah, and a lot of the cases, there's footpaths links that are missing and that type of thing.
Yes.
You might get a footpath in front of a new development, but then 100 metres down the road there's nothing. So, in some cases we're trying to link those up. And I think, Aaron, you're aware of that in your area.
Yep.
We've got a lot of those situations, especially in all these areas that are developing.
Yeah. Well, that's good, encouraging. Thank you.
Tim?
Thank you. So the developments going on in Hallsville, those DCs paid there, where does that kind of, and on the hills with regards to, the example would be, say, the Wolseley Hoonhay intersection and the lack of a footpath along Cashmere and the connection, lack of connection on Wolseley, Westmoreland, etc. So
all that development on the hill, they're all paying DCs, and the DCs are derived from the work we're doing to upgrade Hoonhay Cashmere intersection. The developer had to pay for the easing of the corner on Worsley's Road. They had to fund that totally themselves because that was a requirement through the Resource Management Act for that new development. So you often get a mixture like that. The developer has to fund a lot themselves. Then we're also charging development contributions for the wider area, footpath on Cashmere Road, which, those types of... They're tangible examples of where this works well. And again, it's the growth component. In a lot of those areas, it's just totally new housing. It's not infill, where you're getting one house removed and 5 built in its place. These are totally new subdivisions, new land being subdivided and developed. The developer pays for all the costs of the new roads and all the infrastructure within their development, and also the frontage. So they'll put in a new footpath, curb and channel, that type of thing. And often we insist on a shared path now, so it is for walking and cycling. But also, if there's increased demand in that area through that growth, we are charging for that growth helps address that additional demand that they're bringing to those wider road networks.
Thank you.
Is that clear? Yeah.
Are there any other questions? I just want to look, thank you very much for your questions, for answering the questions in your presentation. a lot was made actually clearer during the presentation, so it was much appreciated. So thank you. What I'm going to do is just adjourn the meeting for 5 minutes because there's a couple of people have signalled to me that they want to make some amendments, and I just will have a wee chit-chat about that and take some advice. So thank you very much. Adjourn for 5 minutes. If we could take the seats, the amendment is going to be a noting provision, which is that note that staff, and I haven't checked this out with staff, but I'm sure they're amenable, that staff will brief councillors on demand credits with a view to consider whether a further policy change might be required. And that enables us to include it in the briefing that we're going to have on the inner city rebates scheme, and then, have we not got nine people? 2, 4, 6, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. No, we're right. We're right. Yeah. Okay. So, okay. Is someone prepared to move the recommendation? Jake, seconded by Mike. Is there any discussion? No. I'll put that motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. That's carried. Thank you very much. So, Sarah, could I invite you to close the meeting, please?
Una hia ki te uru tapu nui o te tāne. Kia wātea, kia mama, te nakau, te tinana, te wairua i te awa takata. Koia rā o rongo whakairia ake ki runga. Kia tina, homie, hui, tai, kia.
Kia ora. Thank you very much. I'll declare the meeting closed. Thank you.